The Queen Mother was supposed to love the whole family equally. That was the public image, the smiling grandmother, the soft matriarch, the woman in pearls who belonged to everyone and judged no one. She had held that image for so long it felt like fact. 6 decades of waving from balconies, turning up at Ascot in matching pastel coats and hats, being photographed with a Dubonnet at garden parties, looking so radiantly harmless and ancient and English that it seemed impossible she could be anything other than what she appeared. She was born Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon on August 4, 1900. She died on March 30, 2002, aged 101. She outlived her husband, one of her daughters, and the normal span of human calculation. In those 101 years, she watched an empire dissolve, a monarchy nearly fracture, a world war, several near collapses of the institution she considered her primary obligation. And through all of it, she smiled and waved and appeared to be enormously enjoying herself. Sustained performance at that level, across that many decades, requires intelligence, discipline, and a very clear sense of purpose. But royal families don't work like ordinary families. Attention inside the Windsor family was currency. Invitations were currency. A private lunch at Clarence House, her London residence from 1953 until her death, was a signal read immediately by everyone who did or didn't receive one. Who sat beside her at dinner? Who got the telephone call after a difficult week? Who received the private letters she wrote with care and regularity? Who she stopped mentioning entirely? She was also substantially more interesting than the pearls suggested. When historians and biographers describe the Queen Mother's relationships within the Windsor family, they aren't describing a grandmother's uncomplicated warmth. They are describing a system of affection that was also a system of power, one that distributed warmth, access, and protection according to a logic that had very little to do with pure sentiment. For 50 years after her husband, George VI, died in February 1952, she sat at the center of her own parallel court. She maintained a household of over 40 staff, partly funded by a £643,000 annual public subsidy, supplemented by contributions from the Queen and Prince Charles, who reportedly paid £80,000 a year to top up the wages of her elderly retainers. 3 residences, Clarence House in London, Burke Hall on the Balmoral estate in Scotland, the Royal Lodge at Windsor, each functioning as a venue where presence or absence was noted and interpreted by every person in the building. The question of who the Queen Mother favored matters not because grandmothers aren't supposed to choose. All grandmothers choose, in the privacy of their preferences. But because when a royal matriarch chooses, the consequences are measurable. They show up in invitations and silences, in letters written and letters withheld, in trust funds and sealed wills, in who gets the house in Scotland and who gets the apology. For years, the easy answer was Charles, the sensitive grandson, the future king, the boy she understood better than his own parents did. That assumption has a real basis, but the truth is more layered, because the question of who the Queen Mother favored is ultimately a question about what she believed, and what she believed runs deeper than any individual grandchild. William Shawcross wrote the authorized biography of the Queen Mother, published in 2009, with access to her private letters, court records, and royal archives. It runs to 1,000 pages. The Guardian's review of it, by Catherine Bennett, is almost as revealing as the book itself, because it documents with surgical precision what the biography chose not to examine. Camilla Parker Bowles appears in the Shawcross biography exactly once, identified as the wife of a royal guest, Andrew Parker Bowles, in a 1970s Castle of May visitor's book, 1,000 pages about a woman's interior life and her beloved grandson's decades-long love affair with another man's wife, earns a single identifying line. Bennett's review noted the omission directly. The arrival of Camilla on the public stage must have caused a temporary wrinkle in the serene old lady's gin, nags, and picnics routine. It was obviously, to any careful reader, far more than a wrinkle. The biography doesn't pursue it. Shawcross was chosen by the palace and understood what that meant. He later condemned the crown as filled with lies and half-truths encased in lace and velvet. The biography he wrote has its own version of lace and velvet, applied with considerable skill. He also later told CBS News, reflecting on the sealed documentary record, that, as a historian, obviously, it's a pity, because history loses. He acknowledged the loss while being part of the system that created it. What makes Bennett's review useful is that it identifies the moments where the authorized version cracks. Shawcross's coverage of the young Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, drawing on letters and diaries from her early life, shows a woman the authorized Shawcross would likely prefer to keep backstage. During and after the First World War, she wrote with adolescent enthusiasm about the naval officers at the Firth of Forth, and complained bitterly about being required to travel to Hackney to sit her school certificate. After a bomb hit Buckingham Palace during the Second World War, she visited the East End where people had died. She then wrote about the visit with genuine emotion and ended the letter by noting that Buckingham Palace was still standing and that this was what mattered most to her. The warmth for the East End was real. So was the priority structure. That combination, authentic feeling coexisting with an absolutely clear sense of what came first, is the most honest thing available about her character. Other sources fill what Shawcross protects. Gareth Russell, the historian whose book, Do Let's Have Another Drink, draws on her diaries and private correspondence, has documented her reasoning with unusual candor. Kenneth Rose, the royal diarist, captured her political conversations and private assessments across decades. His 2 published volumes, Who's In, Who's Out, and Who Loses, Who Wins, provide access to informal conversation that was otherwise extremely good at not leaving traces. Major Colin Burgess, her equerry in her final years, gave direct accounts about what he witnessed inside the Clarence House household. Between these sources, authorized, semi-authorized, and independent, a consistent portrait emerges, a woman of genuine warmth and genuine calculation, who understood that the two weren't mutually exclusive. The governess, Marion Crawford, had learned that lesson earlier. Crawford published a memoir about her years caring for the young Elizabeth and Margaret, a mild, affectionate account by any standard. She was socially destroyed for it, cut off, never received again, denied even the most basic acknowledgments. The Queen Mother participated in that system. She understood the wall around the family required maintenance, and she helped maintain it. The people inside who breached it weren't forgiven. In an ordinary family, a grandmother's preference for one grandchild is a private wound, felt at Christmas dinners and filed away for decades. Inside the Windsor family, it was a structural fact. Birk Hall wasn't just a house. The Queen Mother's residence on the Balmoral estate in Scotland was a destination, a place where a particular kind of royal intimacy happened, away from ceremony, in the evenings, with reels to dance and conversations that had a different texture than formal life permitted. A debutante around Charles's age, who visited during the 1960s, later recalled the parties there as events with a specific quality of closeness and ease, people dancing in a house that felt genuinely lived in, on an estate that the Queen Mother had made her own rather than leaving to institutional upkeep. Getting an invitation to Birkhall signaled something. Not getting one signaled something else. So did the seating arrangements at formal meals. So did the private letters. So did who sat next to her, and for how long, and what happened between them without staff present. Inside a court, the smallest gestures carry the largest meaning because everyone in the building is watching everyone else to understand where they stand. The Queen Mother spoke almost daily by telephone with Queen Elizabeth II during the family crises of the 1990s, according to Shawcross. Staff at Clarence House recognized that the conversations helped the Queen maintain what Shawcross calls her sang-froid and sense of perspective. Those calls weren't just maternal comfort. They were political deliberation happening in private between two women who, together, held the institutional center of the Windsor family. The Queen Mother's views about which family members to support, which to put at a distance, and how much public expression of feeling was tolerable, all of it filtered directly into the formal royal responses to each crisis as it arrived. A cynical courtier was reportedly overheard after George VI's death in February 1952 saying, "Long live the Queen Mother." Not in grief, but in recognition that her position and influence weren't ending. They were continuing in a different form. That observation proved accurate. She operated from Clarence House for another 50 years, adjacent to the formal center of power, quietly defining who was inside and who was out. Prince Charles was born on November 14, 1948, the first grandchild of the Queen Mother's two daughters. That birth order was consequential. He was first. He was the heir. He arrived when his grandmother was at the height of her influence as queen consort, before she had been displaced by the more complicated role of Queen Mother. His childhood deepened the bond significantly, and the circumstances that did so were stark. When Charles was roughly 1 year old, Queen Elizabeth left for Malta to be with Prince Philip on his naval posting. When he was 5, she embarked on a 6-month Commonwealth tour, one of the obligatory early acts of a new queen, presenting herself to her peoples across what remained of the empire. Charles was left in England. His first word, documented in Gareth Russell's biography, was Nana, his nanny, the woman physically present in his daily life, not a parental name. An infant who doesn't know a parental name yet is an infant being raised by someone else. The Queen Mother filled the gap that parental absence created. She told him, "Well done," regularly. She encouraged his watercolor painting, his interest in Shakespeare, the aesthetic and cultural sensibility that his father regarded with something between indifference and impatience. Philip had attended Gordonston in the northeast of Scotland. Charles's description of it, recorded in multiple sources, was "Colditz in kilts." The school was built on outdoor endurance, character formed through physical hardship, the kind of masculine discipline that Philip associated with naval life and the war years. It wasn't built on music, drawing, or the careful reading of poetry. At Birkhall, the Queen Mother offered something entirely different. Evenings that were theatrical in the best sense, dinner with interesting people, conversation that ranged widely, music, the kind of old-world culture that treated England's aesthetic inheritance as something to inhabit rather than merely acknowledge. Charles thrived there in ways he didn't thrive at Gordonston. The Queen Mother noticed this and leaned into it. She encouraged what his parents found either irrelevant or slightly puzzling, and in doing so, she shaped the person who would eventually become king. Charles attended his mother's coronation in June 1953, aged 4, seated in the abbey next to his grandmother. He watched the ceremony from beside the woman who was, at that moment, probably more emotionally central to his daily life than anyone else present. He was old enough to remember it. He was young enough that the relationship had already formed. He grew into a king with artistic commitments that run unusually deep for a head of state. He has painted watercolors for nearly 50 years. In 1987, under the pseudonym Arthur George Carrick, he submitted a small watercolor of farmhouses and a few trees beneath a pale blue sky to the Royal Academy's summer exhibition in London. The curators selected it over 12,250 other entries without knowing whose it was, according to New York Times reporting from 2023. His advocacy for classical architecture, the Poundbury development in Dorset, decades of public campaigning for traditional building design, reflects values formed well before he had a platform to express them. His Duchy of Cornwall practices, his investment in the beauty of the English countryside, all of it points back to an aesthetic education that Gordonstoun didn't provide and Birkhall did. The New York Times, writing ahead of his coronation in May 2023, called him Britain's most culturally attuned monarch for generations. The Queen Mother's world wasn't just his emotional refuge, it was his formation. When she died in 2002, Charles moved into Clarence House as his London residence and took Birkhall as his Scottish home. The Guardian's May 2002 reporting noted that he reputedly beat off a claim to the property made by his father, the Duke of Edinburgh. He wanted to keep the places. Birkhall particularly, the house where the relationship had been built, where the evenings with reels had happened, where the conversations that shaped his inner life had taken place. Inheriting the properties was also, in some sense, inheriting the world she had built inside them. Tina Brown, in The Palace Papers, published in 2022, offered the most precise summary of what the relationship ultimately meant. A reviewer, quoting Brown directly, writes that Camilla Parker Bowles subsumed the role played in Charles's life by the Queen Mother, the woman who always made him the center of her world. That phrase isn't sentiment, it's an analysis of function. The Queen Mother performed a specific emotional role for Charles that his parents didn't perform, and after her death, Camilla effectively inherited the role. Jonathan Dimbleby's 1994 authorized biography covered Charles's upbringing and his relationships with Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. The portrait of a boy who felt emotionally unmoored by parental reserve and found consistent warmth in his grandmother is consistent with what multiple independent sources document about the same relationship. The same woman who gave Charles more warmth than almost anyone also represented the system that required him to be miserable in silence. Her response to the collapse of his marriage was entirely institutional. She viewed Diana as potentially catastrophic. Accounts describe her characterizing Diana as someone who might conceivably pull the monarchy down. The language mirrors how she had thought about Wallis Simpson, and that comparison wasn't casual. She had seen what one unsuitable woman attached to one senior royal could do to the entire structure. She wasn't prepared to watch it happen again. Shawcross, drawing on her private papers, states her position plainly. The washing of dirty linen in public was utterly abhorrent to Elizabeth. Her entire life was based upon obligation, discretion, and restraint. When Charles gave his Dimbleby television interview in 1994, publicly acknowledging the failure of his marriage, she reportedly said it was always a mistake to talk about your marriage. When Diana gave her Panorama interview to Martin Bashir in 1995, Shawcross writes that Diana's public rejection of her husband and his life was contrary to everything that Elizabeth believed and practiced. She also regretted Charles's participation in the Dimbleby project. Both of her closest grandchildren had broken the code. She disapproved of both. Not anger, not condemnation, the observation that it was wrong. In her value system, that was the harshest possible judgment she could express. Diana ceased to exist verbally inside the Queen Mother's household after the separation. Major Colin Burgess, her equerry, was direct about it in accounts published in the Daily Mail. I never again heard her name mentioned by or in front of the Queen Mum. Not criticism, not hostility, simply disappearance. In a court where the Queen Mother's attention was currency, silence about someone was currency withdrawn, and everyone in the building understood what it meant. The practical effect on Diana's standing within the wider family was immediate. When a woman who had been the emotional center of the Windsor world stopped mentioning your name, you had been removed. Princess Margaret later destroyed the letters Diana had written to the Queen Mother, saying they were too private to preserve. Shawcross described the destruction as understandable, although regrettable from a historical viewpoint. The Guardian's Catherine Bennett treated that line as the closest the authorized biography came to criticizing the royal family directly. Those letters would have contained Diana's own account of how the relationship worked from inside, what she asked of the Queen Mother, what the Queen Mother said in response, whether the warmth that had existed early in the marriage survived its collapse. They no longer exist. The paradox at the heart of the Charles relationship sits inside all of this. He had more of her warmth, more consistently, than any other grandchild. She was the anchor of his childhood, the woman who told him, "Well done," when his parents were elsewhere, who encouraged the artistic and aesthetic sensibility that became his most distinctive characteristic as a monarch. That warmth came bound to a complete set of expectations: discretion, endurance, the stiff upper lip as the highest form of dignity. He loved her, and he couldn't sustain the silence she required. He gave the interview. He eventually married Camilla. He did what she had told him was always a mistake. She was alive to see him break the code. We don't know exactly what she said in private. We know the pattern. Prince Andrew was born February 19, 1960, the third grandchild, the first child of Elizabeth II born after the accession. By multiple documented accounts, he is also Queen Elizabeth II's confirmed favorite child, a pattern noted by Andrew Morton and corroborated by royal biographer Robert Hardman. That maternal favoritism is extensively documented. It belongs primarily to his relationship with his mother. The Queen Mother's relationship with Andrew has its own distinct texture, and the evidence points in two directions at once. In June 1987, ITV broadcast, "It's a Royal Knockout." Andrew, his brother Edward, and their wives participated in a medieval-themed charity fundraiser in period costume, presided over by Stuart Hall, involving giant fruit costumes and comedians throwing custard pies. The event was televised. The British press mocked it without restraint. According to Ross Benson's 1993 biography, Charles, The Untold Story, the Queen Mother was incensed, viewing it as making the royal family complete laughingstocks. She spoke to Andrew directly. That response deserves attention. This wasn't the uncritical indulgence of a protected spare. When the institution was publicly humiliated, she said so, directly, to the person responsible. The same woman who was furious about the television special responded very differently when Andrew's marriage collapsed. After his separation from Sarah Ferguson in March 1992 and their divorce in 1996, Major Colin Burgess documented her saying privately, "You know, Andrew does love her so." Tender, bittersweet, forgiving of the human mess that the marriage had become. Not approval of the tabloid circus the relationship had generated. She had been clear in her views about the public display of private distress. Sympathy for the man inside it. That pattern, institutional anger at behavior that embarrassed the crown, personal warmth toward the person behind the behavior, appears consistently across her relationships. She could simultaneously be furious at the royal knockout and gentle about Andrew's feelings for his former wife. This isn't contradiction. It's a woman with a very clear hierarchy of values, trying to find room for both the institution and the human being, in that order. The broader narrative of Andrew as the specifically indulged, protected royal spare relies more heavily on his relationship with Queen Elizabeth II than on what the documented evidence shows of his relationship with the Queen Mother. The Burgess quote and the royal knockout reaction are the clearest available anchors for the Queen Mother-Andrew relationship specifically. The story of sustained indulgence as a pattern, the Queen Mother repeatedly excusing or shielding Andrew from consequences, has thinner documented support than its frequency in popular royal accounts implies. The conflation of the two women's feelings about Andrew is understandable, but worth noting. Princess Anne was born August 15, 1950, the second grandchild, 21 months after Charles. Both she and Charles spent time at Birk Hall under the Queen Mother's care during the Commonwealth tour. That shared early childhood is documented. What diverged afterward was the mythology each relationship generated. Available sources describe the Queen Mother-Anne relationship as warm but unsentimentalized. They shared skepticism about Diana's suitability. The Express reported that both women had a habit of using disparaging nicknames for women they found unsuitable who had married into the family, a small but specific temperamental similarity that cuts through the obvious differences in their styles. The directness, the self-containment, the reluctance to perform emotion publicly. These qualities aligned across two generations. Anne became publicly known for her candor in ways that sometimes startled observers, including candid remarks about the future shape of the monarchy. The Queen Mother's candor was private, expressed in letters, dinner conversations, remarks to trusted diarists, but it was there, and Anne apparently inherited the impulse, if not the discipline, to keep it entirely to herself. But Anne didn't require what Charles required. She built herself into the most prolific working royal in the family, by most accounts, generating minimum scandal in the process, sustaining a workload that made her presence in the institution essentially unassailable. The Queen Mother's protective attention tended to flow toward need. Anne presented very little of it, so she received less of it. The relationship appears to have been respectful and probably genuinely warm, and entirely lacking in the narrativized closeness that built up around Charles. The absence of that mythology isn't a failure of the historical record. It reflects a relationship that didn't require one. Anne was fine. She has always been fine. That capability is its own form of dignity, and the Queen Mother understood dignity. Prince Edward, born March 10, 1964, presents the clearest case of the absence of mythology amounting to its own kind of evidence. He is the fourth grandchild, the youngest, and the most thinly documented in terms of his specific relationship with the Queen Mother. The most vivid available moment is the royal knockout fury of 1987, the same event that produced her anger at Andrew. Edward was also there, also in medieval costume, also on camera. The Queen Mother's reaction to the event was documented as covering both brothers. Beyond that, the available sources offer almost nothing specifically about the Queen Mother-Edward relationship. He married Sophie Rhys-Jones in June 1999, becoming the Earl of Wessex. And there's a brief reference in one source to the Queen Mother bonding with Sophie over charitable work. That's essentially the record. The thinness isn't a research failure. It's information. Something that mattered this much to historians, biographers, and the press produced very little narrative around Edward. That tells you something about how much space he occupied inside the Queen Mother's particular world. William and Harry weren't the Queen Mother's grandchildren. This needs to be stated clearly because it matters significantly. Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward were her grandchildren, the children of her two daughters. William and Harry were one generation further removed, the great-grandchildren, children of her grandson Charles. When she died in March 2002, William was 19 years old and Harry was 17. They had spent their childhoods knowing a woman who was already very elderly, increasingly infirm through the late 1990s, and present in their lives through the layered, complicated emotional landscape of a family reshaped by Diana's death in Paris in August 1997. Harry was 12 when his mother died. William was 15. The Queen Mother was 97. The years between that death and the Queen Mother's own death in 2002 were years of considerable difficulty for both boys, and the elderly woman at Clarence House was part of their extended family during that period. But the relationship operated in very different terms than the relationship between the Queen Mother and her own grandchildren during their childhoods. The mythology of her doting closeness to the boys has been built partly in retrospect. She reportedly gave William prominent seating next to her at family gatherings, showed him more visible attention than Harry at some events, invited him to tea. The emotional documentation for sustained, specific intimacy is considerably thinner than the Charles record. What isn't thin is the financial provision. Money is the most concrete and verifiable expression of how she thought about the next generation. In 1994, the Queen Mother placed approximately 2/3 of her money fortune, an estimated £19 million, into a trust fund for her great-grandchildren. The Guardian reported this in April 2002, framing it as a tax gamble. At 94, if she lived another 7 years, the transfer would escape the 40% inheritance tax. She cleared that threshold. She died at 101, having lived for 7 more years and then 4 more beyond the tax threshold. The gamble paid off for the beneficiaries and cost the Treasury an estimated £7 million in revenue that would otherwise have been collected. The trust covered all of her great-grandchildren, Zara and Peter Phillips through Anne, Beatrice and Eugenie through Andrew, and the children of Princess Margaret's family. But the sums directed toward William and Harry attracted the most press coverage following her death. Her overall estate at death was valued at between £50 million and £70 million, according to The Guardian's contemporaneous reporting. The bulk went to Queen Elizabeth II under a deal made with John Major's government in 1993, which exempted sovereign-to-sovereign bequests from inheritance taxation. The deal, The Guardian noted, was made when she agreed to pay tax for the first time, meaning the Queen accepted income tax in exchange for preserving the inheritance chain from her mother. For ordinary members of the public, the inheritance tax threshold was £250,000. Anything above that was taxed at 40%. The Queen paid nothing. Press reporting from multiple UK outlets put William and Harry's combined portion at approximately £14 million, distributed in 2 age-based tranches, a portion at 21, the larger portion at 40. Harry reportedly received more than William. A legal analysis published by Greenwood solicitors in September 2024, when Harry turned 40, confirmed the age-based structure and put his second distribution at roughly £7 million. The rationale attributed across multiple press accounts to the Queen Mother's own reasoning is this: William would inherit substantial wealth as the future king. Harry wouldn't. Greater provision for Harry was compensatory, ensuring the one who wouldn't inherit the throne had enough financial independence to live a stable life outside the automatic structures of royal inheritance. This isn't sentimentality, it's redistribution, structured according to a clear-eyed assessment of who needed what and why. The specific estate documents remain sealed. The wills of both the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret were sealed by court order shortly after their 2002 deaths on grounds of privacy for the royal family. The Cambridge Law Journal noted this sealing as a departure from the principle of wills as public documents. The figures in circulation come from contemporaneous press reporting rather than probate records. The Guardian's April 2002 reporting on the trust is well-sourced contemporaneous journalism. It remains journalism, not primary documentation. But even with that caveat, the trust itself is unambiguous. At 94, she sat with solicitors and made legally documented financial arrangements for children who were then 12 and 9 years old. The 1994 trust predates by years the family fractures that made the inheritance politically charged. She made it in 1994. That is a documented fact. Her financial situation at the time adds texture worth considering. By 1999, her overdraft at the Royal Bankers Coutts was reportedly running to £4 million. She once told a fellow dinner party guest, apparently with genuine amusement, that she could do with £100,000. She'd had an awful afternoon with her bank manager, scolding her about her overdraft. She maintained a household of over 40 staff while carrying that overdraft, receiving a public subsidy of £643,000 a year, and sitting on an art collection that included a Monet, Study of Rocks, Cruz Fresseline, purchased in 1945 for £2,000 and worth up to £15 million at auction by 2002. Her total jewelry collection was valued at a further £16 million, including a diamond necklace that had once belonged to Marie Antoinette. The Shawcross biography, with its characteristic thoroughness about objects, catalogued among the ornaments on a Castle of May desk, a little corgi from the Buckingham Palace gift shop. A detailed Bennett's Guardian review found richly illustrative of what the biography prioritized. She was, among other things, an extremely sophisticated manager of her financial legacy. The trust, created while that overdraft was accumulating, represents deliberate planning for the generation after her. Whatever the emotional mythology around William and Harry, the most concrete measure of her feelings toward them is a legally structured instrument designed in 1994 and paying out across 3 decades. Inside the Windsor family, the Queen Mother's preferences didn't stay personal. They were read, interpreted, and acted on by everyone around her. The Clarence House household observed everything. Staff noted who visited and who didn't, which telephone calls came in, and which names disappeared from conversation entirely. The house had a comptroller, equerry staff, a footman famously devoted in William Talon, people whose professional lives were organized around understanding what the Queen Mother wanted and ensuring it happened. That organizational structure also meant they processed information about who was in and who was out with considerable precision. When the Queen Mother stopped mentioning Diana's name after the separation, completely in the documented account of Major Colin Burgess, that silence was felt by everyone in the building, and its meaning was understood immediately. From Clarence House, the signal radiated outward. The family read what the Queen Mother's warmth meant and what its withdrawal meant with considerable precision. Kenneth Rose's journals provide a window into the informal conversation of a world that was otherwise extremely good at not leaving traces. His 2 published volumes captured her political conversations, her private assessments, and the texture of the court life she inhabited across decades. Rose was there, repeatedly, and he wrote it down. Shawcross called his journals the most detailed, amusing, and accurate records of the royal world, a recommendation from a man who had read the private correspondence itself. Shawcross's biography documents that the Queen Mother spoke almost daily with Queen Elizabeth II during the family crises of the 1990s. Staff recognized that the conversations helped the Queen maintain her sang-froid and sense of perspective. The Queen Mother wasn't an observer of those crises. She was advising the head of state in real time about how to respond to the public dissolution of 3 of her 4 grandchildren's marriages: Anne's in 1992, Andrew's in 1996, Charles's across the decade. Her views about which family members to support, which to distance, and how much public feeling was tolerable filtered directly into the formal royal responses. She held no official position after 1952. She didn't need one. The letters Diana had written to the Queen Mother, later destroyed by Princess Margaret, who said they were too private to preserve, would have offered Diana's account of how the relationship worked from inside the family system. What Diana asked for, what she was told, whether the warmth that had existed early in the marriage survived its collapse or ended abruptly. Those letters are gone. The gap they leave is significant. Someone in the family considered their content important enough to require permanent removal from the historical record. The cynical courtier overheard after George VI's death in February 1952, "Long live the Queen Mother," had read the situation correctly. Her position and influence weren't ending with her husband's reign. They were continuing in a different form, without a title or a formal role, for another 50 years. The abdication of Edward VIII on December 11, 1936, is the master key to the Queen Mother's entire inner life. Her husband, George VI, born second, raised as the spare, never prepared for the throne, temperamentally unsuited to public monarchy by his stammer and his deep shyness, was pushed onto that throne because his older brother chose personal happiness over institutional duty. Edward had been the glamorous one, the photographed one, the heir everyone wanted. George had been the quiet second son standing slightly to the left in official portraits. When Edward signed the instrument of abdication, witnessed by his 3 brothers, and broadcast his explanation to the nation, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I wished to do without the help and support of the woman I love." The burden transferred to the man Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had married. George VI struggled with a stammer that required significant therapeutic work and sustained effort to manage in public. He struggled with wartime leadership and its aftermath, the speeches, the visits to bombed sites, the negotiations with Churchill, the sustained performance of national confidence when the nation wasn't confident. He died in February 1952 at 56 years old. The Queen Mother was 51. She spent her remaining 50 years believing that the burden his brother placed on him had accelerated his death. The Duke of Windsor was never forgiven. Not privately, not across 5 decades of exile and several tentative family reconciliation attempts. She referred to Wallis Simpson, in a letter to her mother-in-law Queen Mary at the height of the abdication crisis, as someone unworthy of the most modest institutional concession. "If Mrs. Simpson isn't fit to be queen, she isn't fit to be the king's morganatic wife." Philip Ziegler, the royal biographer, documented a conversation with the Queen Mother in which he asked directly why she had been so resolute in keeping the Windsors out of Britain. Her answer? "You can't have 2 kings, can you?" She meant it practically. The presence of a former monarch, especially one who had made the choice she found most unforgivable, would have been a constant reminder that alternatives to duty existed. She couldn't afford that reminder. Everything she did within the Windsor family for the next 50 years flows from that conviction. The institution must be protected from the people inside it, including the people she loved. Especially the people she loved, because they were the ones with the capacity to damage it from within. That is why she compared Diana to Wallis Simpson. Not cruelty, pattern recognition. She had seen what one unsuitable woman, attached to one senior royal, could do to the entire structure. Wallis Simpson had set a crisis in motion that, in her accounting, killed her husband. Diana was, in her private assessment, someone who might do it again. The comparison was the highest stakes judgment she knew how to make, and she made it relatively early in the marriage. That is why the Dimbleby interview, the Panorama interview, the entire public dissolution of the Wales marriage was to her not just embarrassing, but actively dangerous. She had spent 60 years limiting the supply of ammunition for the monarchy's critics. Every public confession, every televised grievance, every published biography was a round handed to the opposition. She said so plainly about the Dimbleby project. It was always a mistake to talk about your marriage. She had lived by that rule since 1936. And that is why, at 94, she arranged a trust fund for children who were then 12 and 9. The institution needed to carry forward. The people who would carry it forward needed to be financially secure enough not to make desperate choices. The unequal split toward Harry was itself institutional logic. If the heir is financially secure by birthright, ensure the spare is financially secure by bequest. Keep both of them in a position to serve. She loved her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The warmth is documented across sources that don't agree on much else. But the love was always filtered through the same operating question. Is this good for the crown? What does it cost to grow up inside a structure where a grandmother's warmth is simultaneously genuine and political? For Charles, the cost was a particular kind of trap. He received more of her warmth, more consistently, than any other grandchild. She was the emotional anchor of his childhood, the woman who told him, "Well done," when his parents were elsewhere, who encouraged him to paint and read Shakespeare, and developed the aesthetic sensibility that eventually made him genuinely unusual among 20th century monarchs. That warmth came bound to a complete set of expectations: discretion, endurance, the stiff upper lip as the highest form of dignity. He loved her, and he couldn't sustain the silence she required. He gave the Dimbleby interview, he eventually married Camilla, he did what she had told him was always a mistake. For Diana, who was never inside the shelter of the Queen Mother's favor, who was assessed from early on as a potential institutional threat, the cost was erasure. Not dramatic expulsion, simply becoming absent from conversation. In that world, the two amounted to the same thing. The emotional architecture of the Windsor family rewarded people who adapted to the institution's demands and quietly expelled those who couldn't or wouldn't. The Queen Mother presided over that architecture for 50 years. She made it run smoothly, and she made it, when the situation required it, merciless. Who was her favorite? The honest answer is that the question is slightly wrong. She didn't distribute warmth according to a simple preference for one face over another. She distributed it according to a logic, and the logic was institutional. Charles received the most warmth because he needed it most, because he was the heir, because their aesthetic world was genuinely shared. And he also received, packaged with that warmth, the implicit requirement that his happiness was secondary to his function. Andrew received her sympathy when his personal life collapsed, and her fury when he made the family look foolish. Anne received her respect, and probably her quiet approval, for being exactly the kind of self-sufficient, undemanding royal the institution needed and rarely produced. Edward received very little documented attention, which is itself a form of information. William and Harry received her money, carefully planned, legally structured, strategically distributed according to need rather than preference. The preferences moved through the Windsor family like a current for 50 years, invisible from outside, felt precisely by everyone inside. In an ordinary family, favoritism creates resentment. In a royal family, it creates history. A smile could mean love. A lunch could mean approval. A gift could mean protection. A silence could mean exile. The question of her favorite matters not because grandmothers are supposed to choose, but because royal matriarchs always do, even when they pretend not to. And the deepest answer, the one that makes sense of everything else, is that her truest favorite was never a person. It was the crown itself. She loved the grandchildren who served it best, gave the most protection to the ones she was most afraid of losing, and quietly withdrew from those who threatened it, even when she loved them. Especially when she loved them. Subscribe for more stories like this.